Hello and welcome to revision tips for CIPS Level 3, Advanced Certificate in Procurement and Supply Operations. This is Module 2, Ethical Procurement and Supply, and it's Learning Outcome 3, which is to understand the significance of ethics for procurement and supply. So in this learning outcome, we look at the importance of the CIPS Code of Conduct, the use of codes of ethics in procurement and potential conflicts of interests and how to deal with them. Now, a code of ethics outlines what is acceptable and unacceptable behaviour within an organisation. It can help to guide and contribute to the success of an organisation by aiding cohesion, particularly across a large multinational organisation. It contributes towards an organisation's reputation and offers protection to the organisation if an individual breaches the code. Areas covered in the Code of Ethics look at things like the values and behaviours, such as work fairly, impartially and transparently to promote honesty, respect and integrity. The principles is how an organisation intends to meet its values like customer satisfaction or meeting certain standards like ISO standards, continuous improvement or having a CSR policy in place that needs to be adhered to. It then looks at personal responsibility about how each individual is responsible for making sure the code is upheld. Individuals are responsible for reporting breaches to the management. Compliance looks at the standards like the ISO 9001 or 14001 policies. And reporting looks at if management encourages staff to speak in confidence about their concerns or give them some way of reporting breaches anonymously, it will help to uncover anything wrong that's going on in an organisation. So all these things on the screen show you what is included in the field of ethics. And if we think about the CIPS Code of Conduct relating to the Code of Ethics, it asks you to foster an awareness of human rights, fraud and corruption issues in all of your business relationships. You've got responsibility for managing any business relationship where unethical practices come to light and taking the appropriate action, not only to report them, but to remedy them. It requires you as well to undertake due diligence of appropriate supplier relationships, and that's in relation to things like forced labour or modern slavery, and any other human rights abuses such as fraud and corruption. And another part of the code seeks for you to continue to develop your knowledge of forced labour, modern slavery, human rights, fraud and corruption issues, and apply this in your professional life. Now, we've learned from previous sessions about who stakeholders are, but just to remind us of our internal stakeholders, we've got people like marketing, sales, production, operations, human resources, finance, design, development, distribution, facilities, senior management, and the board of managers. And I suppose a stakeholder is an individual or a business that's got an interest in your organisation. And we know there can be internal or external. The external ones are customers, consumers, communities, other groups, the government and suppliers. And we also know from previous sessions that we use the Mendelow's matrix to help identify how to engage with each group of stakeholders depending on the level of power and interest. So high power, high interest, these are your key players, you must manage them closely. High power, low interest, keep satisfied. High interest, low power, keep informed, and low is minimum effort required. So understanding where your stakeholders fit on that will help you to determine which style of management you need to use for that stakeholder. They all require monitoring to ensure they uphold the Code of Ethics. And methods can be used like sitting in on a meeting or auditing documentation. And if stakeholders don't uphold the Code of Ethics, that could cause problems for your organisation. Some of the problems would be things like bribery, corruption, coercion and fraud, some form of modern day slavery. It could include unfair treatment of employees, pollution issues, refusing to correct defects or getting incorrect feedback of customer reviews, which is more of an issue for people who use online platforms. Now, I would say when you're looking at the when you're looking at this matrix, it's the people that have got the high power, I guess, that could be breaching code of ethics. So it's just one to bear in mind, I guess. Examples of breaches to the code of ethics include things like not disclosing a conflict of interest, breaking confidentiality, and not offering acceptable working conditions or accepting bribes. So what should you do if you suspect there's been a breach in the code of ethics? The answer is to report it as soon as possible. But if reporting it would be difficult for you, then you need to consider whistleblowing. Now, some organisations have a whistleblowing policy which allows members of staff to anonymously report breaches. Alternatively, you could just write an anonymous letter and addressing it to the relevant person. There are some other things on the screen I didn't mention, like not paying a fair salary. Believe it or not just accepting bribes, but it's also a breach to accept a bribe as well as to bribe somebody. They're both as bad as each other. Committing fraud and theft, and creating any form of pollution. So, if we can encourage individuals to report breaches or suspected violations to our code of ethics, it will reduce or eliminate court cases, which are obviously incredibly costly to an organisation. It's not good publicity either for the business. In addition, it will help to retain the staff, because staff are not going to stay in an organisation that feels like there's, often dodgy things going on. They won't want to be associated with it. So the likelihood is a company that's got repeated breaches would have a high turnover of staff, which will cause them a financial constraint in the sense that they're going to have to spend money on recruitment or additional costs using interim resources. And if you add these two things together, it will help to improve the profit if you can keep those other costs down. Now we're going to look at conflicts of interest. A conflict of interest is where an individual's personal situation interferes with or can be seen to interfere with their professional judgment. And it happens in two ways. You can have an actual conflict or just a perceived conflict. An actual conflict is where a procurement professional has to make a decision that may affect them personally, whereas a perceived one is where a procurement professional has private interests that could affect decision making but doesn't necessarily. And the five main areas in which conflicts of interest occur is firstly financial, for example, being offered money in return for being awarded a contract. Materialistic, so that could be offering gifts or days out in return for being awarded a contract. Prejudicial is influencing decisions through the use of authority. Personal which could include acting differently because of friendships or relationships or doing people favours. And then professional, being offered promotion if a contract is awarded to a certain supplier. So how do we identify potential conflicts of interest? Ask yourself these four questions. If the answer to any of these is yes or maybe, then there probably is a conflict of interest. So, for example, is there any financial gain? So if a spouse worked for a buyer's supplying organisation, then clearly they're going to get some income. Personal relationships. So here we've got an example of a contract coming up for renewal and the buyer giving the work to a family member. Similar situations. This one looks at where maybe a consultant might be working for two businesses that are in competition with each other. And finally, if you ask yourself, should it be disclosed? And you're umming and ahhing about it, then the likelihood is that you should. So the 4Ds model can be used for assessing conflicts of interest and addressing them. So always report suspected potential conflicts of interests. Action can be taken then to address the situation. It may be that there is no actual conflict. As I said earlier, it could just be a perceived one, not an actual one. But the fact that it was disclosed ensures that the buyer's ethical conduct is transparent. So the 4D models shows how you address it. Firstly is to disclose the potential conflict to your organisation. The second would be to distance yourself from the contract so you've got no direct input. The third would be to delegate the task to a colleague who has no conflict of interest with the supplier. And that you'd use that if you're unable to distance yourself or disassociate yourself from the deal completely and objectively in the contract process, especially if it's really important to your organisation. And in order to maintain and prioritise good conduct outlined in the Code of Ethics, you need to ensure that you review and update your Code of Ethics regularly. You need to induct your staff and train them when they first join, but also refresh them on an annual basis. And as a manager, you need to lead by example. And what you can see on the screen here is what we need to do to communicate with the employees. So you give them an opportunity to digest what you're telling them, but also give you some feedback. So ultimately what this is saying is that if somebody does come back and suspect or report a suspected breach, you need to take action and most of all prioritise people over profit. Thank you for watching, and I would just recommend that you look at the CIPS Code of Conduct on the CIPS website.